Welcome back, everyone. It seems we hear about cases of deadly overdoses more and more, but who's to blame? State Attorney Melissa Nelson thinks at least some of the responsibility should fall on the drug dealers. But would charging dealers for murder ever be possible? Joining us now to discuss, we welcome legal contributor Seth Pajcic. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the chat.
So back in May, Nelson made an unprecedented drug prosecution. So can you kind of explain what happened?
Well, there was an overdose. A person was taking, I think, a heroin mixture cut with fentanyl. And what Melissa Nelson has done is she has charged the dealer with felony murder, and she has charged the two people that the girl was with when she was taking the drug with manslaughter.
Oh, wow.
Now, I understand and I appreciate her charging the dealer with murder. I think that's awesome, holding people accountable. However, why were the other two held as accessories?
Well, here is, under Florida law, if you're guilty of culpable negligence and results in the death of somebody, you can be prosecuted for manslaughter. And I think, reading through the news stories, I think I know Melissa. I worked as a prosecutor and I worked with Melissa back in the early 2000s. And what I would say is this: reading through the stories, the two people that were with the decedent, when they called 911, they were asked 2 or 3 or 4 times, was she taking any drugs? And they said no. They said no. I think if they had been upfront and honest, yes, so she has stopped breathing, she's taken drugs. If the people had been honest with 911, I doubt Melissa would have charged them with anything. It would be, when you're in that situation with someone who overdoses, that's what you should do. You should call 911, but you need to be honest, because that's going to change the way the first responders treat the person.
Is this where we're headed now, where we're going to be charging these dealers when people
Well, as I think everyone knows, there's an awful opioid epidemic in Florida and nationwide. And I think the governor recently signed a bill adding fentanyl to the list of drugs that you can be charged if you sell it for felony murder. And I think that is the direction we're moving in, because it's not enough. Yes, you need to have education. You need to have treatment for people. But these people who are selling these drugs, they need to be punished and they need to be held accountable. And I think Melissa recognized that. There has to be 2 prongs: treatment, education, but also there needs to be a law enforcement angle to it, because I think if you're a drug dealer and you know if I sell these drugs to somebody and they die, you're going to think twice about selling those drugs if you know you can be prosecuted for murder if you sell those drugs, end up in prison for the rest of your life.
Well, the 2 people, sorry, because I mean, this is something that I feel like people worry about a lot. So they said on the 911 call that she wasn't taking drugs, and I'm sure they wouldn't admit to drug use themselves. But do people do things like that because they're scared that if they admit to taking drugs that they will get charged also?
That's a possibility, but they...
And could they get charged if they admitted to it?
I believe there's a Good Samaritan exception, that if you call in when somebody has a drug overdose and they ask, is there a drug overdose, and you say yes, I believe there is an exception. I mean, obviously there's prosecutorial discretion, and that's one thing I think that's great about Melissa so far as she's been the state attorney. As we see, there's been a change from the previous state attorney to Melissa. I think she does a much better job of using that prosecutorial discretion to say, well, this is when it's appropriate to charge somebody and this is when it's not. And I think in this instance, when you have 2 people that don't tell the truth to the first responders, this is the exact instance where they should be prosecuted for manslaughter.
Let's talk about pharmacies, though. What could happen to pharmacies? Do you think they could just possibly shut them down altogether, just fine them? What do you think will happen to them?
Well, there have been, throughout the country, fentanyl oftentimes is sold over the counter in patches. So that's the best way. So people put a fentanyl patch on. And there have been several cases throughout the country where they've sued the manufacturers of these patches because they end up putting too much of a dose in the patches and the people end up dying of overdoses. There are not enough warnings on the label. That's really what the civil angle would be in these kind of cases, is if was there not enough warnings, is the drug itself defective. But this fentanyl that's on the street that's being used to cut the heroin, this is stuff that's bought on the street, not through pharmaceutical companies themselves.
Okay. All right, well, something else that we wanted to talk to you about, probably one of the biggest stories this week, a parole hearing for O.J. Simpson is set for tomorrow in Nevada. O.J. was sentenced to as much as 33 years for his role in an attempt to recover memorabilia from his storied sports career. Now, this isn't his first parole hearing, right?
It is not. I think he had a prior parole hearing back in 2013. And at that time, the parole board said that, you know, he's been a model prisoner, and I think they actually recommended release, but he wasn't up for parole. His original sentence, I think he was he was eligible for release out of parole after 9 years, which is where we are now. I believe he was sentenced back in 2008. So now he's eligible for release. So he has had a prior parole hearing. Obviously, I think the reason his sentence was what it was is because in the back of his mind, I think the judge knew what had happened back with his former wife and the murder prosecution there. Obviously, he was found not guilty, but I still think that had to be into the judge's account because the crime he was convicted of, it's hard to imagine you'd be sentenced to 33 years.
Was it an obviously kind of gross sentence for the crime?
From what I understand, he was getting back memorabilia that was stolen from him. Now, you shouldn't have been using a gun, but typically speaking, you're not going to be sentenced to over 30 years in prison for getting back stuff that was stolen from you in the first place.
You usually go down for something else.
That's right.
Not what you actually did. So what are his odds of actually getting parole then?
Sounds like juice about to get loose.
It sounds like it. It sounds like he has a pretty good chance. In fact, I think I just read that the victim of the robbery, he's recommending that O.J. Simpson get released. And it is unfortunate and sad for the Brown family, because I think they felt like they finally got some justice in being sentenced, but they're not eligible to even testify at this hearing because it has nothing to do with that case.
So what is actually the process they go through before they approve or deny release?
I think they look at what the person's prior record is, his behavior in prison, his likelihood to commit another offense once he's out. And you know, if you look at O.J. Simpson's just record in himself, he had no prior criminal convictions prior to this conviction. And so they'll look at all those factors. And based on that, and also the victim of the crime saying he's recommending his release, I think there's a good likelihood he is going to be released.
With the victim coming out and saying that, does that really add to the possible approval of his release? Like, do victim statements really get considered that highly?
They do. I think judges, my experience when I was a prosecutor, the judges definitely take into account what the victim wants. I mean, I think we, for example, take it to a local level. One thing Melissa Nelson did is there was the murder case involving the Farrah girl out on the north side, and she took into account the fact that the victim's family didn't want the death penalty, and so they decided not to pursue the death penalty, which was something her predecessor did not take into account. She continued to pursue the death penalty even though the victim's family didn't want it.
What about the prior victim's family, the Brown family you talked about from Nicole Simpson, Brown family? What if their family were to write the judge as victims and say, we know that he didn't go down for this crime, he did go down for this crime? Would that play in there anyway? Would the judge consider that?
If he wasn't convicted?
I don't think that, I don't think they're even allowed to consider that, honestly, because it has nothing to do with the crime he's up for parole for. And he was found not guilty of that crime. And so this is a parole board that ends up making this decision. And if they base their decision on the factors it's supposed to, in my opinion, unfortunately, but he would probably be released.
So if he's released, of course, there's going to be with stipulations. I'm sure he'll get some type of probation, house arrest, or whatever it may be. What kind of life could O.J. Simpson have? I mean, he has to make money some kind of way. What kind of life professional life you think he'd have after being released?
Not much of one. I mean, I don't know anyone's going to hire O.J. Simpson to do anything. He may go back to trying to sell sports memorabilia, but remember, there's still a huge civil judgment hanging over his head. There's a great likelihood he's going to end up right back in Florida because he can put his money into a house in the state of Florida, and that is, you cannot use a civil judgment to seize someone's house in the state of Florida.
Maybe a few books, a few more movies.
No, a reality show with Casey Anthony.
Oh, I did hear about that.
Who knows if that was fake news?
He'll find it.
That's probably what they'll end up doing.
Would any of us watch that, a reality show?
Yes.
I'm sure there's some people that would watch it.
Yes.
No,
yeah.
Sure. All right, well, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it. And we'd like to thank our legal contributor, Seth Pajcic of the law firm Pajcic & Pajcic. Now, coming up next, an expert on brand building, something O.J. could probably use. We find out how this former ESPN reporter transitioned into being a highly sought-after publicist when we come back.